A funeral scene that was never meant to happen became the moment the cameras had to make peace with real life. In the spring of 1978, the writers of a beloved rural drama sat in a room and faced an impossible task. How do you write around the death of a man the entire country had come to think of as its own grandfather? This wasn't fiction anymore. This was Geer, the actor who played Grandpa Zebulon Walton, and he had just died. What followed on screen, and off it, would become one of the most quietly devastating chapters in American television history, a story of illness, ambition, grief, and the simple, brutal fact that no family, not even a fictional one built on Blue Ridge mountain warmth, can stay whole forever. The Waltons premiered on CBS in 1972, based on the semi-autobiographical writings of Earl Hamner Jr., who drew from his own Depression-era childhood in rural Virginia to create the Walton family, a sprawling, hard-working household led by John and Olivia Walton, their 7 children, and John's parents, Zebulon and Esther. Audiences fell for its unhurried pace, its earnestness, its refusal to be cynical in an era when television was starting to lean darker. But behind that gentle glow, the show was quietly absorbing one loss after another, and the reasons its actors departed were rarely as simple as moving on. They were medical. They were personal. They were, in more than one case, matters of life and death. Richard Thomas, who played John Boy, the eldest son and the show's narrator, the character closest to Hamner's own voice, was the first major departure, and his exit set the tone for everything that followed. By 1977, after 5 seasons, Thomas made the decision to leave. He has spoken in interviews over the years about wanting to broaden his career beyond a single defining role, and about the practical realities of his personal life at the time. He and his wife had welcomed twin daughters, and the demands of carrying a lead role in a weekly hour-long drama were enormous. Thomas wanted room to grow as an actor, to take on film work, to not be permanently frozen in the amber of John Boy Walton. It was, by most accounts, an amicable parting rather than a bitter one. The producers, faced with the loss of their central narrator, made the unusual choice to recast the role rather than write John Boy out entirely. Robert Whiteman stepped into the part for the show's 6th season, playing a John Boy who had survived a wartime injury and returned home changed, a narrative device that gave the recasting some in-story justification, even if it never fully replaced what audiences had lost. Thomas would return decades later for reunion specials, and his relationship with the Walton family, on screen and off, remained warm. But his 1977 exit was really the first sign that this show, for all its comfort, could not hold its cast in place forever. Then came the losses that no contract negotiation or creative disagreement could have caused. Geer, who played Grandpa Zebulon, was already in his 70s when the show began, a veteran stage and screen actor whose career stretched back decades and who had, notably, been blacklisted during the McCarthy era for his political activism before rebuilding his career from the ground up. Geer brought a lived-in gravity to Zebulon Walton, a sense that this man had actually walked mountain trails and split actual firewood. In early 1978, Geer was hospitalized with respiratory problems. He died on April 22, 1978, at the age of 76. The show's writers were left with the task of honoring a character audiences loved without exploiting the real grief of a cast and crew who had lost a genuine friend and mentor. Zebulon Walton's death was written into the show, and the episode dealing with it was handled with a restraint that many critics at the time noted felt less like drama and more like an actual eulogy, because, in many ways, it was. Almost in parallel, Ellen Corby, who played Grandma Esther Walton, faced her own health crisis. In 1976, Corby suffered a serious stroke that left her with impaired speech and partial paralysis. For an actress whose entire performance relied on sharp, no-nonsense line delivery, this was a devastating blow. Rather than write her off the show, the production made a choice that was almost unheard of for network television at the time. They wrote Esther Walton's own stroke into the storyline, allowing Corby to continue appearing, now playing a character whose recovery mirrored her own real one. Corby's resilience became part of television history. She continued to make appearances on the show into the early 1980s, and remarkably, despite the visible effects of her stroke, She received an Emmy nomination for her performance during this period, a testament to how much audiences and the industry respected what she was doing, not in spite of her condition, but because of the raw honesty she brought to portraying it. Corby's story wasn't really about leaving the show in the traditional sense. It was about a slow, difficult, partial departure forced by circumstances entirely outside her control, met with a kind of grace that few actors have ever had to summon on camera. Michael Earned, who played Olivia Walton, the family's matriarch, left the show under very different circumstances, ones rooted in ambition rather than illness. Learned had already won multiple Emmy Awards for the role by the late 1970s, and by the show's 8th season, she made the decision to step away. In numerous interviews over the years, Learned has been candid that she felt she had done what she could with the character and wanted new challenges as an actress. She didn't want to be defined solely by the role of Olivia Walton for the rest of her career. The show's writers addressed her departure through a storyline in which Olivia contracted tuberculosis and had to leave the family home to recuperate at a sanatorium in Arizona, a plot device that allowed the character to exit gracefully while leaving the door open for occasional returns. Learned did return periodically for guest appearances in later seasons and for reunion television movies, suggesting that her exit, much like Richard Thomas's, was ultimately about creative restlessness rather than any conflict with the production. It's worth noting how honest this pattern was for the era. Many long-running shows of the 1970s simply killed off or silently dropped characters whose actors wanted out. The Waltons, instead, tended to write truthful, almost tender explanations, treating its departing cast members with the same dignity the show itself was known for. Ralph Waite, who played John Walton Sr., stayed with the series for its entire original run, but his story deserves mention because it illustrates just how many of these actors were quietly building lives and ambitions beyond the Walton farmhouse. Waite used his time on the show to develop his skills as a director, helming several episodes himself, and he would go on to have a long and varied career in film and television long after the show ended, including an Emmy-nominated run decades later on NCIS, Los Angeles. His commitment to the show was steady, but even he has spoken about the pull actors on long-running family dramas feel, the tension between gratitude for a role that gave you a career and the fear that it might also become the only role anyone remembers you for. The younger cast members had their own, quieter departures and reductions, shaped less by dramatic crisis and more by the simple passage of time. Judy Norton, who played Mary Ellen, and John Walmsley, who played Jason, both grew from children into adults over the course of the show's run, and their storylines evolved accordingly. Marriages, careers, the natural widening of a family narrative that had begun with children and had to eventually let them become grown people with their own arcs. Mary McDonough, who played Erin Walton, has spoken in later years and in her own memoir about the pressures of growing up on a hit television show, including struggles with body image and disordered eating that she has said were intensified by industry pressures during her teenage years on set. A difficult and honest account that adds a layer of complexity to what looked, from the outside, like a wholesome family production. These weren't dramatic firings or walkouts. They were the slower, more human reality of children growing up in front of a national audience, carrying pressures that a show about a loving, stable family didn't always shield them from in real life. By the time the original series concluded in 1981, after 9 seasons, the Walton family that audiences had first met in 1972 looked very different from the one that said goodbye. Richard Thomas had left for broader career horizons. While Geer had passed away, his death folded permanently into the show's own narrative. Ellen Corby had fought her way back from a stroke to keep playing Esther, a battle few viewers fully appreciated at the time. Michael Earned had chosen to step back in search of new creative ground. Each departure carried its own private weight, and yet the show, true to its own values, tried to meet each one with honesty rather than erasure, writing real illness and real ambition into its fictional framework rather than simply pretending nothing had changed. What makes the story of the Waltons' cast departures so different from so many other television exit stories is the absence of scandal. There were no bitter contract disputes splashed across tabloids, no public feuds, no accusations of mistreatment driving anyone away in anger. Earl Hamner Jr., who remained deeply involved with the show as its guiding creative voice and its narrator throughout its run, has spoken with evident affection about the cast over the decades, describing the production more as an extended family than a workplace. That doesn't mean the departures were painless. Losing Geer was a genuine tragedy that the entire cast and crew had to carry through production, and Corby's stroke forced everyone around her to adapt with compassion rather than convenience. But the pattern that emerges, when you look closely at why each actor actually left, is not one of a show falling apart from the inside. It's the pattern of ordinary life intruding on an extraordinary production. Actors aging, bodies failing, ambitions shifting, children growing into adults who wanted more than one role to define them. Perhaps that's the quiet lesson buried inside this story. The Waltons was built around the idea that family endures through hardship, that love and loyalty outlast poverty and war and personal loss. It turned out that the cast members who brought that family to life were living out a version of the same truth. They got sick. They grieved. They grew restless. They grew up. And in nearly every case, the people around them, on screen and off, chose to meet those realities with tenderness rather than dismissal. Richard Thomas came back for reunions. Michael Learned returned as a guest more than once. Corby kept working as long as her body allowed her to. Geer's memory was folded into the show with genuine reverence rather than quiet erasure. In an industry not always known for its patience with actors who fall ill or ask for more, the Waltons, in its own understated way, modeled the very values it spent 9 seasons trying to teach its audience. Decades later, watching those early episodes again, knowing now what was happening just off camera, the show reads less like simple nostalgia and more like a document of real people quietly holding each other up, long after the credits rolled, long after Walton's mountain went dark for the final time, and long after the good night had been said for good.